4, 3.
All right, and welcome back to the Aristotle Show, Politics, Book 1, this lecture, this video, dealing with chapters 5 to 13. This book essentially lays the groundwork of Aristotle's view, at least in terms of what the household is really about. And remember, the household is the fundamental composite, really, of the politics, of Aristotle's politics. And of course, the politics is all about the great koinonia, that type of complexity, that type of structure, that type of entity in which an individual can achieve eudaimonia. So, in this discussion here, have a look at this. So far, we're talking about the context of the household. So we're still always talking about that. So, and what we've had is this notion of a slave, that is an articulation of what a slave is. And as Aristotle says, it's very important to have a slave because you can't run the household without it. And if you don't have a household, you can't have people living well with their at least getting their basic needs satisfied and living well at that level of the household. And of course, you'll never get a polis if you don't have a household. It's as I said, it's the fundamental composite. Now, is it just? Is slavery just? He's talked about how it's necessary, you need it and all that, and he's tried to explain what it is. Is it just? And Aristotle's argument, again, I keep stressing, Aristotle's discussion of slavery is incredibly controversial. If you go and look up in the scholarship on Aristotle and slavery, there's all kinds of views. All kinds of views. Some people say that Aristotle's discussion of slavery and the household and all this sexism and all that, we should just ignore it. It's an aberration. It's just, it's jumbled up stuff. It doesn't even really fit with Aristotle's other views. I'm not that sympathetic to that view. I think it does largely fit with a lot of a lot of the other things Aristotle says. Then some people say, yeah, but he said it, but he didn't really believe it. That might be. Sometimes in history, authors do say things that they may not have been totally convinced of. Often if you go to a conference and listen to a professor present a paper and then ask her, afterwards, say, yeah, did you really believe all that? And sometimes it's like, well, I'm putting forward a position and my ideas are still they're still fluid, so to speak. They could move around a bit or change or whatnot. So it's possible that Aristotle didn't really buy into all this. And of course, never forget that we don't have the actual works from Aristotle's hand, right? These are all copies of copies. And so there can be changes to the text or whatnot. But that's only going to explain so much. So clearly Aristotle thought that slavery was important, and he did make some attempts to justify it. So let's have a look at it. But remember, one of the big hurdles that he didn't jump, that he jumped it, he didn't mention it, is that really at the end it's not axiomatic that it is immoral, intrinsically immoral for a human to own another human. He doesn't see that. Okay. All right. So how does he go about this? Again, it's in the context of the household. And he brings in some things we've already seen. The dichotomy, the natural ruling and being ruled. He thinks this is a natural and necessary pair. We've seen this before in the earlier chapters of this book. And he says it's natural, it's necessary, sometimes advantageous. Now, we might agree with this in some sense, like maybe parents should rule over children. It doesn't mean you own them or anything like that, but you have to look out. So maybe kind of a sense of, you got to kind of rule over your dog. You got to maybe put a dog on a leash, right? If there's a lot of traffic around and your dog could see a squirrel and get hurt or something. So we might say, yeah, okay, in a limited sense. But Aristotle, is taking a much stronger sense, like, something like an essence, and that the thing that I said for dogs, he's going to raise it up and bring it to the human level. So we can agree with some of Aristotle's principles that he uses even to justify a result that we might not agree with, but we might say, well, we don't agree with the broad use of those principles. We might regard them as much more restricted. And that's a bit of a lesson, a takeaway in the history of philosophy. Some principles that were used in earlier philosophers, you find this in the history of science and mathematics, that people thought they had a universal principle or a really wide-ranging principle, and maybe today we might say, well, no, it's a subset of more general principles, or it's a particular case that you made the mistake of generalizing and then regarding it as universal. Okay. So, back to this. Some things move towards ruling. So it's a natural movement. Some naturally move towards being ruled. In some cases, some things are both, that they naturally are ruled by certain things, and they in turn would naturally rule others. So it's a bit more, it's not just absolutely just ruling and just ruled. Those might be the ends of the spectrum, but in the middle, there would be, individuals that have both a ruling and a ruled component to them. Okay. Now, because some things are naturally ruled over, Aristotle then says, well, looks like it's in their best interest to be ruled. And because some things naturally rule, it's in their best interest that they rule. So you can see all the teleology, you can see Aristotle's arguments of, well, if it's natural, then it's set up that way. Kind of natural is for the best. This is how things are set up, and this is ordered properly by nature. Nature doesn't do things just random and haphazardly. Now, Aristotle admitted, as we saw in his discussions in biology, that nature has types, and nature has deviations from type, sort of these random kinds of things that we saw when Aristotle was trying to figure out, reproduction, like why do you sometimes get females and why do you sometimes get males? So he does introduce these things, but by and large, he thinks it's a very nicely, tightly ruled system. Nature does things for the best, by and large, pretty well all the time. And so when something has a natural property, then that's good. If its natural property is to be ruled over, it's good that it be ruled over. If it's a natural thing to rule, it's good, it's in the best interest. All right, so that's ultimately how he tries to justify that there are going to be some human beings who they're naturally ruled over types, and it's in their best interest to be ruled over. Aristotle would, children, and then he, of course, as we might agree that children have to be looked after and taken care of and protected. I mean, we have all kinds of rules for looking after children, and a lot of them are, making sure they don't get themselves hurt or things like that. It's in their best interest to be governed. We would probably, again, agree with it, this notion of in the best interest to be ruled, but it's the extension of these principles. And then, of course, the whole thing of the extension of the notion of ownership from inanimate objects, not just to, and again, do we own today, like do we really own our dogs, right? Do we own them like the way we would own a car? That's now, I mean, for Aristotle, he would have said, yeah, well, he wouldn't have known about cars and things, but he would have thought that was pretty well the same thing. Can you bump it up to humans? And Aristotle seems to be okay with some humans being owned, and of course, we now completely draw the line on that. So the rest of the book is going on and looking more in detail into household management. Chapter 6 looks at more on the ruler, the nature of the ruler, and the superiority of the ruler's goodness also serves to justify slavery. And he doesn't always mention it, but I think it's important to always keep in mind that his discussion, at least for consistency's sake, is really about the household. So it's not that the case that we know for sure if Aristotle would have justified it completely in general in all circumstances or whatnot. Again, we're talking about that household slavery where, it's, again, the question of praxis, not of making, but the doing, for the good life and all that in the household. 7 and 8, 7 goes on to proper treatment of slaves. So Aristotle thinks that it has to be regulated. There's, so it's not like, and clearly by bringing in the notion of proper treatment, he doesn't think that just any old treatment is acceptable. So it's not at the complete discretion of the owner. Proper acquisition, again, that's part of household management. Same thing more generally in terms of property acquisition. Chapter 9, more on the use of property in the house. 10 and 11, again, there's a lot more discussion on acquisition. 12 and 13 sort of cap it all off by talking a little bit in more detail about household management as a moral art. So Aristotle did not, he would have regarded someone who ruled, and was vicious and brutal to the people in the household. Yeah, that's a barbarian. Right? So Aristotle wants us to think of the head of the household as yes, it's the male that's the head of the household, aims at the good of each level. So again, we still have a notion of a person in power having a broader life and imposing restrictions on the one, but supposedly in their best interest. More concerned, so aims at the good of each level. And more concerned with humans than inanimate property. But again, at least with slaves, they are regarded as property. So what's again curious about, as I mentioned earlier, did Aristotle really believe all this stuff? I think he certainly spent a lot of time talking about it, and I've only scratched the surface with all this. And he thought slavery was necessary. He thought it could be just. With proper restrictions and all that. But he fundamentally did not think it was fundamentally unjust, that it was, absolutely intrinsically immoral to own another person. Now, the interesting sort of thing, and I'll end on this note, my discussion of the politics for now, is Aristotle in his will. As the story goes, he freed his slaves. Right? So he let them all go. He freed them in his will. He said, let them go. Well, that's kind of odd, right, when you think of it. If you spend all this time saying, well, not only is it necessary, is it just, or especially like if you get into this kind of stuff, well, Aristotle would, his slaves are naturally ruled over. It's in their best interest to be ruled. Is it in their, why is he letting them go, right? It's kind of an odd one to think that maybe that's not in their best interest to let them go. That's what he's been saying. So again, I leave on this note that it is still a really controversial thing as to what Aristotle really ultimately himself, the historical figure, would have thought. But I think it's clear that he thought it was part of the human story. It might not have been the nicest part, but in some way it was advantageous to this. But again, at the end of it all, he clearly violates what we regard today as the fundamental transgression of having humans owning other humans. So that's it for now. Boom, we're done. See you another time, perhaps.